Welcome everyone. So happy to be learning together again, as always. Today's class is a Hasid in medieval Garb, piety and popular religion in Ashkenaz and beyond with Dr. Rachel Furst. She likes to be called Rachel. I don't think I need to mention anything about how we run the class, because I believe everyone with us have already been here a bunch of times. But I also want to welcome our viewers on Facebook Live, and feel free to make comments and ask questions there. I'll be monitoring that chat on Facebook as well. And with that, I'll just turn this to you, Rachel. You can unmute first, and I'll make you a co-host.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I apologize, everyone. I've had some unfortunate, very last-minute computer troubles today, so I hope they are resolved, and I hope that we will be able to proceed without any further glitches. Okay, so again, welcome back, everyone, and thanks for rejoining. What I'd like to do today is actually our penultimate class of this series. It's our seventh class in an 8-part series. Next week, we'll have the opportunity, I hope, to summarize a number of the themes that we've been following throughout the series, and to perhaps pull together a number of the different threads that we've been following throughout. What I'd like to do today is first, very briefly, to review some of the main points from last week's class, and then to go back, because we didn't quite get to the end of what I had wanted to discuss last week. I want to pick up with one final discussion from last week's class, which you may recall was looking closely at the theme of charity, of tzedakah, and how that featured into the piety program of Hasidei Ashkenaz and Sefer Hasidim. And then we're going to be moving on to our new topic for today. Today we're going to be looking at shame and humiliation and the role that they played in the approach to piety of, again, Sefer Hasidim and Hasidei Ashkenaz. So I'd like to do this, again, first the recap from last week, and I will, I just, again, want to remind those of you who were with us last week that when we looked at the topic of charity or tzedakah in the thought of Hasidei Ashkenaz, as in particular as it is or was reflected in Sefer Hasidim, we spoke about the fact that charity was generally one of the core pious practices of Jews in medieval Ashkenaz, and really Jews throughout the ages. But nonetheless, we attempted to trace a few ways in which Sefer Hasidim related to charity, again, charity as a form of pious practice, in a unique manner or in a distinctive way. And I highlighted two particular regards or senses in which the approach of Sefer Hasidim to charity was different. First and foremost, insofar as Sefer Hasidim valorizes poverty. And that, as we pointed out last week, is not something that we see in classic Jewish sources. We took a look at the Rambam, and we spoke about some other sources that really focus on how poverty happens to people, but really that wealth is considered a blessing, and moreover, one who has money, who has funds, is in fact prohibited or is really enjoined not to give away all of his wealth, because making oneself poor is in fact, in and of itself, a problematic act. Again, this is in classic Jewish sources. It makes a person dependent on the community. It does not allow a person to appreciate the blessing that he or she has been given. And so in the regard that Sefer Hasidim, as I said, valorizes the idea of poverty, that poverty for Sefer Hasidim is to a certain extent in and of itself equated with piety. This is something really distinct and new, different than we see in most classic Jewish sources. And we began to discuss a little bit last week where that might have come from, because in fact, while it doesn't align with classic Jewish sources, it does seem to align with a classic Christian approach. And we spoke about that a bit last week. The second manner that we discussed last week in which Sefer Hasidim's approach to charity is unique, or at least distinctive, is insofar as for Sefer Hasidim, Sefer Hasidim talks about a hierarchy of the poor. It spends a lot of time discussing which poor are deserving of charity and which poor are in fact not deserving of charity. Now, whereas the idea that there are some poor who are more deserving than others is an idea that we see in some other Jewish sources, including the Talmud itself, Sefer Hasidim, as we discussed last week, seems to take it a step further than any of the other sources that we discussed. And Sefer Hasidim equates giving charity to the wrong poor, to the non-deserving poor, with actual sin. In other words, giving charity is obviously a valorous deed that Sefer Hasidim really encourages, but giving charity to the wrong poor is for Sefer Hasidim sinful. In the context of discussing this, we began to look at the types of people that Sefer Hasidim highlights or singles out as being the undeserving poor. And I see that Evie just put last week's source sheet in the chat for anyone who did not yet get that. I'm actually going to share my screen with you right now, and I'm going to be sharing last week's source sheet because I want to take a look at that for just a few extra moments to finish up a part of the discussion that we cut short last week. So let me just get that up on the screen. I hope you can see that here now. This is last week's source sheet, and I want to go towards the end here and take a look very quickly at this source. It's from Sefer Hasidim, the Parma edition. As you can see here, passage number 857, where Sefer Hasidim, you may recall, we read this last week quickly, writes a righteous man, a tzaddik. The Sefer Hasidim is imagining a situation in which a person has funds to give to charity, and before him stands, on the one hand, a righteous man. The Hebrew is, or the original is, a tzaddik who is in need of charity. And on the other hand, there is a wicked man, and the language that Sefer Hasidim uses to define this person is rasha. And Sefer Hasidim further adds that this person is a wastrel and a drunkard, zolel v'sovea. That these two men stand before you to receive charity, and you can only give to one of them. And the rasha kind of ups the stakes here by saying to you, if you do not give him the money, he will convert to Christianity or commit another offense, right? So he's kind of upping the stakes by threatening that if he is not the recipient of these charity funds, he will go out and do something terrible, but not that of murder, right? He stops short of saying that he will go and murder someone else. Well, says Sefer Hasidim, give to the tzaddik and let the rasha go to hell. Right, and I think that's a pretty direct translation of harasha yelech legehinom. However, enjoying Sefer Hasidim, if he's about to commit murder, give him the money as a ransom for the innocent man so that he will not be killed. Right, that's where Sefer Hasidim draws the line. If someone's life is hanging in the balance, if someone's life is in danger, and if you're not giving the charity funds to this wicked man will in fact lead to another person's death, then better to give the wicked man, the undeserved funds, even though it is going to deprive the tzaddik of the tzedakah that rightfully belongs to him. Now, the reason that I'm returning to this particular passage is what we began to discuss at the end of last session is that this term rasha, which appears in this passage, but in many passages throughout Sefer Hasidim, has been a source of some dispute and debate among contemporary scholars who study Sefer Hasidim and Hasidei Ashkenaz, right? The literal translation of rasha is a wicked person, right? And in this passage, I think it's pretty clear why this person is being called wicked, right? It sounds like a pretty classic case of evil, of wickedness, right? This person is, threatening not only to convert to Christianity, to commit offenses, but even to murder people. Nonetheless, as we discussed last week, some of the most outstanding scholars of Sefer Hasidim insist that when Sefer Hasidim speaks of rishaim, of evil people, Sefer Hasidim is not referring to your average, if we can say that, or your classic wicked person, sinning person who does not follow in the ways of God, but rather Sefer Hasidim uses rasha as a sort of I don't know if euphemism is the right word, or but as a synonym for a non-Hasid. Right, and we've discussed in the past how Sefer Hasidim's very elitist attitude towards those who it imagines to be part of the community of Hasidim. And this is, again, regardless of whether we think there was a historical community of actual Hasidim, right? Certainly for the authors of Sefer Hasidim, there is an at least envisioned community of Hasidim. And the authors of Sefer Hasidim are very denigrating of anyone who does not count in that community, anyone who has not adopted the behaviors and the morals and ethics of the Hasidim. So much so, argue these scholars, and I want to specifically call out Ivan Marcus, who we have mentioned beforehand is one of the outstanding contemporary scholars of Sefer Hasidim. So much so that when we read of the Rishaim in Sefer Hasidim, we are meant to understand that the authors here are speaking specifically of non-Hasidim. I want to take a look, at that, at an expression of that we saw, let me just get to the right source here. This is Ivan Marcus in his masterpiece, Piety and Society, his major work on Hasidei Ashkenaz. He writes, giving charity is still another religious obligation, which Judah interpreted and applied in a sectarian fashion. Right? In other words, tzedakah for the authors of Sefer Hasidim is a pious act, particularly when it goes to other Hasidim. Right? So when we talk about the deserving poor, well, says Ivan Marcus, for Yehuda Hasid, meaning for the authors of Sefer Hasidim, the deserving poor are first and foremost other Hasidim, other pietists, despite the risk of creating tensions with non-pietist acquaintances and even family. By indicating how a pietist should give, Sefer Hasidim reveals the author's exclusivistic scale of values. Moreover, and again, he's now synthesizing various passages of Sefer Hasidim, the one that we just saw, but many that we saw, other ones that we saw last week and beyond. Giving money to a non-pietist is in fact a sin for the authors of Sefer Hasidim. Not giving charity to a non-pietist, right, avoiding giving charity to someone who is not a Hasid, is itself an act of pietism. One should go to great lengths, even leaving town, to avoid supporting non-pietists, including one's own father, and we saw that passage last week. unless a non-pietist threatened to murder someone if a pietist does not give him charity, and this is what we just saw, right? So it should be very clear, right, that Ivan Marcus understands the Rasha in the passage we just read to be not any old wicked person, but a non-pietist, right? Unless a non-pietist threatened to murder someone if a pietist does not give him charity, a pietist must not yield to threats to commit a sin. Even if he should threaten to apostatize, and we just saw that, right? The pietist is to resist helping a non-pietist. Let the non-pietist, the Rasha, right? Sheilech legehinom, let a non-pietist, says Ivan Marcus, that's what it means, go to hell. Now, this approach or this understanding of the passage that we just saw and other passages that refer to Rishaim in Sefer Hasidim has been contested by other scholars of the work, in particular by Chaim Soloveitchik, who we have also discussed as one of the really outstanding and important scholars of the work in recent decades. And with regards in particular to the passage that we just saw and to Ivan Marcus's overall claim that for Sefer Hasidim, giving money, giving charity to non-pietists is what is referred to as a sin. Chaim Soloveitchik writes as follows: as context alone tells us the meaning of certain words, meaning is then a conclusion that we draw from the text. And drawing conclusions from the text of so aggregated and heterogeneous a work as Sefer Hasidim is no simple matter. He says, listen, right? What we're really arguing about is how to interpret the word rasha, right? Terms, right? And we know that, oftentimes, right? Not only in Sefer Hasidim, in all works, right? Context is sometimes the only way that we can appreciate the meaning or certainly the nuance of particular words. Now, the reason he's going into this is because he does not dispute the basic point that Marcus is making, which is that the authors of Sefer Hasidim were very elitist and understood there to be a serious hierarchy between the pietists and anyone who was not one of the members of the pietist community. Nevertheless, he says, right, we have to be really careful about how we interpret and understand certain words. I'm picking up with the third line here. Terminology was never a Hasidic strong point. And not surprisingly, they never coined terms which firmly distinguished between the general pious and the pietists, right? What he's arguing here is that, and again, we've discussed this in the past in various contexts as well, Sefer Hasidim is a really complex work, right? We've spoken about the fact that Sefer Hasidim was in all likelihood written by multiple hands. It's very hard to argue for any kind of consistency in Sefer Hasidim because Sefer Hasidim is so varied. And so to suggest that the word rasha consistently means a non-pietist is really tricky, he says, right? Now he's arguing that in general, they weren't such sticklers about terminology. Right, their bent of mind did not tend to fix terms, and they never gave themselves a fixed name, as did, for example, the Polish Hasidim or the Sabbatians. Tzadikim, Tovim, Mehuganim, Yirei Hashem were all used interchangeably, and we have in fact seen all of those terms used with reference to the Hasidei Ashkenaz in Sefer Hasidim itself. They added new content to these old words, but did not and could not remove their old contents. In other words, they co-opted these words and used them to refer to their distinctive community. But in doing so, they couldn't extract older meanings. The result, they called themselves by a host of shifting names, and they called all other ordinary law-abiding Jews by the same names. The terminological ambiguity is ours to resolve. In other words, yes, sometimes they referred to non-pietists as Rishaim, as wicked people. But that doesn't mean that the term rasha or wicked loses its meaning as simply a reference to evil. And in fact, says Soloveitchik in the continuation that I did not bring for you here, right, he argues that the passage that we just saw about the Sefer Hasidim's attitude toward giving charity to non-pietists Marcus, he says, took it way too far, right? When Sefer Hasidim says, don't give money to a wicked man who threatens to go convert to Christianity or to do all these other terrible sins, right? Except for murder, right? That's again where he draws the red line. That's not a reference to a non-pietist. He's not saying don't give charity to anybody who simply doesn't follow the dictates of the Hasidim. He's really talking about a good old wicked person, right? Let's not take it too far. Okay, I want to put aside for now this discussion, this holdover from last week, our discussion of charity, and again, we'll pick up the threads of that discussion and pull it all together, as I said, hopefully next week in our concluding session. What I want to do for the remainder of our time today is to talk about the new topic, which, as I said beforehand, is shame and humility. Shame, excuse me, not humility, but shame and humiliation, not unrelated to humility, but shame and humiliation as it featured in the approach of Sefer Hasidim to the concept of piety. And this is something, and I'm going to now share a different screen with you, just one moment. This is something that we have, in fact, seen in previous weeks in the context of our discussion of other topics. So it's a theme that I'm going to pick up from earlier discussions and try to flesh out a little bit more. Bear with me for one moment as I get up the new PowerPoint. 1 second. Sorry. Okay, you may recall, sorry, let's just get this full screen here. Second. Okay. You may recall that back a few weeks ago when we were discussing dress and the role that dress played, or the way in which dress functioned as a form of pious practice, one of the forms of dress that we focused on was the wearing of tzitzit and tefillin, which was in the 12th, late 12th and early 13th century. Again, what today is considered a basic religious practice, in the 12th and 13th century seems to have been not commonly practiced in Ashkenaz, but the wearing of tzitzit and tefillin was specifically associated with Hasidei Ashkenaz. The fact that it wasn't a common practice, but that it seems to have been embraced and adopted by the Hasidei Ashkenaz, is the reason, is the ostensible reason that Sefer Hasidim discusses the wearing of tzitzit and tefillin as an act that often brought scorn and ridicule and even shame upon those Hasidim who adopted this practice, right? Wearing tzitzit and tefillin was apparently, or at least in the perception of the authors of Sefer Hasidim, considered to be such a ridiculously pious act, right? Such an over-the-top sort of expression of religiosity, because again, it was not something that most people seem to have done at the time, that in fact, again, it was cause for scorn and shame. And I want to remind you of this passage that we saw back in that discussion, where the author of Sefer Hasidim begins by citing this verse from Tehillim, Ki elecha horagnu kol hayom. It is for your sake that we are slain all day long, which I want to remind you, as we discussed at the time, was a verse with a very particular valence, very, very strong undertones for medieval Ashkenazi people, insofar as that verse was often co-opted as a verse or used to valorize actual martyrdom. Martyrdom as in being willing to submit to death or even to kill oneself for the sake of God, which was an ideal that was embraced fairly widely, scholars argue, in medieval Ashkenaz. We won't go into that right now. But the fact that Sefer Hasidim reinterprets that verse and understands Psalms here to be referring not to an act of actual martyrdom, of submitting to death for the sake of God, but rather these are the people who are subject to embarrassment, shame, and humiliation for observing the commandments, right? A totally different form of martyrdom, right? Martyrdom insofar as you are willing to be ridiculed for serving God, right? That already off the bat suggests is a type of friction, I think, that Sefer Hasidim is running up against, already should make us alert to the way in which Sefer Hasidim is distinctive here, insofar as it is promoting, as we'll see in just a moment, this willingness to be embarrassed, to be shamed, to suffer humiliation in the observance of commandments or in acting in a pious manner, as something really, as I said, distinctive, as a form of, or as an expression of one's extreme piety. So again, as we saw, these are the people who are subject to embarrassment, shame, and humiliation for observing the commandments. And specifically, as we discussed several weeks ago, when one comes forward to perform the commandments of tzitzit, tefillin, and others, his blood is then spilled, kivyachol, right, at least metaphorically, while being shamed, or he is humiliated as if his blood is being spilled. Right? So there's an equating here, right, of someone who's actually willing to suffer martyrdom. And again, we're talking about a community where there were a lot of people who actually were put to death for holding on to their faith or their commitment to God. But says Sefer Hasidim, this is, in fact, or is certainly also a reference to those who are willing to be humiliated for their service of God. This type of ridicule prevents them from fulfilling the commandments. Now, this, what again, as I said just a moment ago, what I'd like to take a look at is the way in which this embrace or this idealization of humility marks piousness for the authors of Sefer Hasidim. So we're going to take a look at that and say this comes up in many passages throughout the work. For example, the following, where Sefer Hasidim tells a story about a certain Hasid whom another individual used to shame and say bad things to. The community said to him, "Let us reproach him and excommunicate him," meaning the insulter. And he, the Hasid, said to the community, "Learn from me and do as I do. Just as I suffer and don't allow you to fight on my behalf, so when you are blasphemed by base men all day long," right, he's quoting here from Psalms, another place in Psalms, "do not pay attention. Does it not say, and Moses was the humblest of all men? And also there was never another prophet in Israel like Moses?" Right? So what Sefer Hasidim here, right, is promoting this idea of humbling oneself by being willing to submit to ridicule, by being willing to accept humiliation without contesting it, right? Remaining silent, not speaking up, and not even allowing others to defend you in the face of scorn or shame and humiliation, as being, in fact, a trait in line with that of Moses himself, right? Moses, the Torah singles out Moses as being the humblest of all people. The Torah clearly relates to Moses as being, the ultimate prophet, the tzaddik of all times, the paragon of piety, I guess we could say. And therefore, says the author of Sefer Hasidim through this story, this parable, right? We too are supposed to embrace, to be humble, by embracing or by being willing to suffer shame and humiliation without response. Right? So I think this gives us a little bit of a sense of exactly what Sefer Hasidim has in mind when it promotes humility through humiliation, right? When it promotes this idea of, here too, I imagine some of you must be thinking, right? This sounds, well, yeah, as we have seen in the past, Sefer Hasidim is grounding its ideas in Jewish tradition, right? Arguing this is what Moses did. This is what Moses did. This is how we are like Moses. This is how we are, classic Jewish pious people. But again, I think for many of us, this doesn't sound very Jewish, right? What does this perhaps sound like? I imagine I'm not the only one who, exactly, I'm not the only one who hears echoes of, turn the other cheek, some very classic sort of Christian ideas of the willingness to suffer shame, to suffer humiliation without response as an expression of piety. And by this point in time in the course, I think this should not surprise anyone, because we've seen time and again that many of these forms of piety that are promoted by Sefer Hasidim, certainly for those of us schooled in kind of classic, you could say Jewish tradition, sounds strikingly Christian, or sounds certainly to have been impacted, to have been influenced is always a tricky word, but certainly to be picking up on some themes that we also know were expressed very prominently in medieval Christianity, in the religion, the culture of the majority that Sefer Hasidim, in the environment that Sefer Hasidim grew out of. As we discussed in the past, though, yes, does someone have a question?
Yeah. Is it possible also that this is a reflection of the social reality of the Jews in medieval Ashkenaz, where you tried to hide that you were a Jew because if it was overtly demonstrated, you were humiliated. And so this is sort of turning this into a positive thing. I am also thinking about, you see pictures of the Balei Tosfos or Rashi wearing tefillin all day. Is it a question of that they did not wear tzitzit or wear tefillin, or that they kept it hidden or did it only behind closed doors, as opposed to others who were very demonstratively open about, like wearing a kippah in the street nowadays is open, and one didn't do that because if you did it, you would get, forget about humiliated, you would get beaten up, if not further.
Okay, so thank you for that question. So first of all, going back to, I'll just briefly refer back to the discussion that we had in our session on dress as a pious practice, and anyone who missed that is, I think, has the opportunity to go back and to listen to that week's discussion. That was week number 4, I believe. Or of course, take a look at the source sheet from that week. But in any event, yes, as we saw, as we discussed in that context, part of what Sefer Hasidim promotes as a pious practice with reference to dress is a public expression of identification with the pious, with the pietists. And again, that's, depending on how you read it. But yes, meaning doing sort of publicly displaying, some would say publicly flaunting one's religiosity. And for Sefer Hasidim, that seems to have been very important. The willingness to identify oneself with a particular community publicly, the willingness to display one's religious conviction publicly, was definitely for Sefer Hasidim an important part of being a Hasid, being affiliated with Hasidut or with this community of Hasidim. just very briefly, I hope that this answers your question, at least in part. The argument is not that the rabbinic leaders of the 12th and 13th century were not performing the mitzvot of tzitzit and tefillin. Let's assume, as you say, Rashi and Balei Tosafot were specifically associated with certain kinds of tefillin. Let's assume that they were. But that it was a practice that had been abandoned, I suppose we could say, by the masses, right? It was not a widespread normative practice, even of people who were otherwise part of, again, there wasn't really an option of being part of anything other than the religious community in the era. It was not the suggestion, and again, this has been demonstrated by historians in all kinds of ways, that the average Ashkenazi Jew was not wearing tzitzit and tefillin. And I mentioned briefly at the time that seeming neglect of a very basic practice, right, which has all kinds of causes, and don't want to go back to all of that right now, was not only something that we associate with the community of medieval Ashkenaz, but in fact seems to have already been the case in Gaonic times, for, again, all kinds of reasons that I don't want to go into right now. All that being said, the Hasidei Ashkenaz are actually credited, I guess we could say, by some of these historians with repopularizing those practices in the 13th century. With, again, making the wearing of tzitzit and tefillin the provenance not only of the scholarly elite, but in fact a much broader spectrum of the community. So again, that goes back to the discussion of the impact or the influence or the extent to which Hasidei Ashkenaz really represented broader trends beyond this ostensibly small community. Okay, so, but anyway, I want to pick up, I want to perhaps follow up what you said, Chaim, in another way by going back to this question of whether what we're hearing, are we hearing echoes of Christianity in some of these let's say non-normative approaches to things like humiliation and shame, or, and perhaps this is what underlies your question, or are we simply hearing another take, an alternative take on, in fact, a solidly Jewish tradition, right? And that's a question that we keep returning to, right? Are these foreign ideas that are being right? Environmental influences that are being expressed by Hasidei Ashkenaz, or are these, again, just sort of unique, different, distinctive takes on more traditional ideas and approaches? And I want to ask that question again now and see if we can relate to that in some way in the next several minutes of our discussion. Yes, another question.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure. Did you see Zella's comment in the chat?
No, I did not. I apologize.
No problem. Do you want me to read it to you, or wait?
Please.
Okay, perfect.
Please, or Zella, you're welcome to.
Are there diaries, pinkasim, or anything else that gives a realistic picture of their actual actions rather than what was written as an ideal?
Okay, so that's a great question. And again, I assume you're talking about the Hasidim of Sefer Hasidim. It's a great question. Again, this debate that we've been following throughout, or returning to throughout, as this question of whether the Hasidim that are depicted so evocatively in Sefer Hasidim really existed, right? And what you're asking is, do we have any external evidence or any additional evidence for the existence of these Hasidim? The answer is, well, diaries, no. We have, unfortunately, very few of what historians might call ego documents, right? Sort of personal writings of anyone other than the rabbinic elite, right? Mm-hmm. For our knowledge of Jewish life and Jewish practice from this era is very, very dependent on the writing of the scholarly elite. And that's something that we always need to be mindful of, right? That's something that methodologically is a challenge for historians in all different sorts of contexts, because the ideas that the scholarly elite might have had about what should be happening, or even what was happening, as we know from our own day and age, do not always match up with, in fact, other people's experiences. But unfortunately, for this medieval period, we don't have diaries or other kinds of sources of that nature. So as historians, we have to be, sort of methodologically creative in terms of trying to get at the voices of the people who were not the scholarly elite writing these texts. And I want to actually say in this context, perhaps in parentheses, that for historians of this era, Sefer Hasidim is actually a really important source for learning about the life of medieval Ashkenazim beyond the Hasidim themselves, because it discusses all kinds of situations of daily life that we don't hear about in many other, let's say, rabbinic texts that we have. That being said, I do want to remind everyone that Sefer Hasidim is not the only evidence that we have for Hasidim or Hasidei Ashkenaz, right? We have seen other sources that make reference to Hasidei Ashkenaz. Just as an example, I'll remind you of one of the important external references to Hasidei Ashkenaz was a reference to their prayer practices, which also seemingly distinguished them in the eyes of their fellows. A reference to that by Rabbi, the son of Asher ben Yechiel, but a reference to that by the author of the Sefer HaTurim, the Baal HaTurim, who refer to these prayer practices of Hasidei Ashkenaz. So we do have a few references, external sources that do refer to these Hasidim, but nothing that comes close to describing them or to depicting them in the way that Sefer Hasidim does. And that's really one of the sources of that's part of why there is such a controversy, right? Is this community of pietists that we hear about so descriptively and evocatively in Sefer Hasidim, is that a figment of the imagination of this, or an aspirational, we could say, idea of the author? Or did it really exist? And many scholars currently believe that it probably did not exist as a full-fledged and widespread communal phenomenon in the way that the authors of Sefer Hasidim seem to depict it, right? That probably a lot of what Sefer Hasidim discusses or describes did not match actual historical reality, at least not in great numbers. I hope that answers the question. Yeah. Okay. But now let's go back to this question of humiliation and shame and how that featured into their approach to piety. So we just read this incident about the Hasid. I want to take a look at our next source now. In fact, right, just to demonstrate or to underscore the claim that humiliation, shame was extremely central to Sefer Hasidim's own definition of what it meant to be a Hasid, I want to point to this passage, again, from the Parma version, although there are variations on this passage in other manuscript versions of Sefer Hasidim as well, where Sefer Hasidim asks, why is in fact the Hasid called a Hasid? Right? Where does that term come from? And by the way, right, we know that discussion of Soloveitchik's that we saw just a few minutes ago, that certainly the term Hasid was not coined, it was not created by Hasidei Ashkenaz by any means, right? We've seen in previous weeks that the Talmud itself already refers to, the Hasidim Rishonim, right? The idea, the association of Hasid with pious person or piety does not begin with Hasidei Ashkenaz or with Sefer Hasidim by any means. Nevertheless, right, Sefer Hasidim asks, well, why do we, right? Why do we, Hasidei Ashkenaz, call a Hasid? And the first answer that Sefer Hasidim gives is, well, this is an etymological explanation, right? Hasid comes from the word chesed. Chesed refers to kindnesses, right? A Hasid is called a Hasid due to his kindnesses. But, says Sefer Hasidim, there's another reason, and perhaps a more important one, and that's because he's called a Hasid because of the verse V'hachasida and the stork. This is in Sefer Devarim in Deuteronomy's list of birds that are not kosher, whose Aramaic translation is the chuvrita. Right, you can see that in the Aramaic, in the original. Right now, chuvrita, well, that connects with a Hebrew word, even though it's Aramaic. It connects up with a Hebrew word that we see in the verse in Isaiah, no more shall Jacob be shamed, no longer shall his face grow pale. There, pale has now been connected up linguistically with the Aramaic translation of the word of the name of the bird Hasida, the stork. And this suggests that the Hasid is called a Hasid because they shame him and make his face grow pale. And he, in response to this shaming, is like one who is deaf and mute. He does not open his mouth or shame any person in response, in return, right? Which again is the same or a variation on the same theme that we saw in the previous passage, right? Hasidim not only take the humiliation, right? They do not humiliate anybody else in return. And by the way, I want to note that this passage over here, I'm showing you this a little bit out of, or entirely, I should say, out of its original context. This passage in the Parma version of Sefer Hasidim comes immediately before the passage that we began with. This is 976, the passage of the interpretation of the verse Ki elecha horagnu kol hayom, the martyrdom verse, as being a reference to the embarrassment and humiliation that a Hasid is willing to suffer. This passage 9 is 976. It comes immediately after the one that we just saw about questioning why a Hasid is called a Hasid, which is in fact 975. So it's part of this sort of series of passages that Sefer Hasidim weaves together to delve into this theme of humiliation, of shame, and the way that it features into the very concept of Hasidut, that it in fact inspires the name that is used for the pious person, for the Hasid. I'm actually going to skip over that passage for the moment. And I want to take a look together at the one that comes immediately after, right? We just saw now 975, 976, and now we're up to 977 in the Parma manuscript of Sefer Hasidim, right? Following Sefer Hasidim's discussion of why is the Hasid called a Hasid, and then afterwards how martyrdom for the Hasid is actually about accepting shame and humiliation. Sefer Hasidim follows that with the following discussion, or following vignette, I should say. One person, says Sefer Hasidim, used to abuse and insult a Hasid. But he, the Hasid, did not get upset, even as the man would curse the Hasid's body and his possessions. Right? So again, we've heard this over and over again, right? The Hasid is, the typical experience, the classic experience of the Hasid is being shamed and humiliated, right? And by the way, I'll just add in parentheses, right? As per our discussion with the tefillin and the talit, Sefer Hasidim, by the way, kind of provides some sort of explanation as to why the Hasid, why were these Hasidim subject to so much shame and humiliation? Aside from the fact that they seem to have occasionally adopted unpopular or at least unusual expressions of religiosity, at least for their time, like wearing tzitzit and tefillin, Sefer Hasidim actually, in many places, seems to suggest that they were not especially popular with their non-Hasid, community members, because sometimes they seem to have been really insufferably self-righteous and, overly pious in a way that really rubbed that in a lot of people's faces, in a manner that you can sort of appreciate why might have elicited these humiliating and shaming episodes. So in any event, we have here yet another story about a person who used to abuse and insult a Hasid, and the Hasid didn't get upset, even as he was subject to all these curses. But, says Sefer Hasidim, when this man cursed the Hasid by saying he wished him many sins so that he might lose his share of the world to come, that grieved and upset him, right? Suddenly he was shaken from his complacency, right? As long as the curses were aimed at, his body, his possessions, his whatever, he just, held up and withstood the humiliation as a good Hasid would. But when this man started directing the curses or wishing upon the Hasid sinfulness, right? Hoping that the Hasid would fail and sin, specifically so that the Hasid would thereby lose his share in the world to come, that kind of made the Hasid lose his cool. His students, in fact, asked him, why did you get so upset, right? You're a Hasid. You've been, the paragon of withstanding humiliation and shame. Why, what broke you here? And he said to them, when he shamed me, with the original curses, he didn't harm me. I don't need honor. For when a man dies, he can't benefit from honor, right? I don't mind being, trampled on and, ridiculed and scorned and humiliated in the usual kinds of ways, because I don't need the honor that others perhaps expect or demand. But when he cursed my benefit in the world to come by wishing that I might rebel against God, then I feared lest he cause me to sin, right? Then I really got shaken up because I thought, wow, now I really might lose it. Now I really might sin. Right, and I want to pause here for a moment and ask you, what is this passage telling us, right? What does this passage suggest? First of all, at the basic level, right? What is the Hasid suggesting was the difference between the first set of curses and the one that really shook him? And what does that suggest about the ideals or the approach of these authors? Well, it's kind of it's a little difficult to tease out here, right? Why did he lose his cool?
Why? Because because these pietists are so focused on olam haba. This world means nothing. These are just material, gashmius things, and it's all ruchnius. So, I can humiliate myself or be humiliated. It doesn't matter as long as my soul is pure. But if he curses me that I might sin, and that might actually, his words might actually come true, and then I sin, then I'll be denied my place in olam haba. Oy, oy, oy.
Okay, so it definitely, I agree, right? It definitely underscores how what the ultimate important, right? The one thing that the Hasidim were really, held as being of importance, of significance, untouchable, was a place in the world to come, right? They scorned, and that's why perhaps they were willing to suffer all that, right? They did not care about their standing, about their status in the current world. Really, all they were aiming for was a good place in Olam Haba. Okay. Any other ideas? Yeah.
But I don't quite get this, because why is the pietist taking this Rasha's words so seriously? I mean, does he really think that he's going to start to sin because some lowlife is abusing him verbally?
Okay, so the question, right? Thank you for asking that question, right? When, again, what, right? This basically, it's another way of asking, right? What shook him about the second set of curses?
Maybe that
Right.
this person actually understood about the world to come, or, how you would get there versus rebelling against God or whatever. I mean, like, I'm assuming that the person who's doing the shaming is kind of an ignorant loud, but maybe he knows enough how to get to people emotionally.
Okay, well, he certainly knew how to push the buttons of the Hasid, although it took him a few tries, right? His initial attempts were not successful, but he ultimately got to the one. I to try and answer your question, right? I think what the Hasid says here is, right, why did I lose it? And again, the students are as baffled as we are, right? That's what they ask him. What shook you, right? What he says is, when he threatened my world to come, when he cursed my benefit in the world to come, then I got nervous because I thought he might end up being right, because I thought I might actually sin, right? Right. The scorner, right, was cursing him by wishing upon him sin, and the Hasid says, I thought I really might sin. Now, I don't know, as you say, that he was, that he suddenly was starting to take this guy's curses seriously and thought that because the guy was cursing him to sin, then suddenly he would, be inundated by sin. It seems to me that what he's saying is, because this affected me in the way that it did, I thought I might actually, I suddenly lost it, because I thought I might end up where he wanted me to go, because I thought that in response to him, right, this was going to trigger me to sin, right? At least the way that I think one way of reading it is that he was afraid, right, that he would actually sin here, that he would actually, that the curse would come true, because the words would provoke him to respond. He was not supposed to respond, right? And these words, once the guy started touching him, started poking at his Olam Haba, which, as Ruth said beforehand, was, the one thing that for the Hasidim was really sacrosanct. Then he thought that he would, in fact, sin and perhaps lose his Olam Haba by responding, by the very act of responding to this instigator, right? By the very act of not being able to withstand the shame and humiliation and being provoked by him, he sensed that this curse would in fact come true. I'm just keeping my eye on the clock here. I think there's more to be said about that, but I want to take a look together at excuse me, whoops, what just happened here? Sorry, one second. I want to take a look together, excuse me. Whoops, sorry, one second. Okay, so I want to take well, you know what? Sorry, I'm just thinking aloud here. Okay, we're not going to take a look together at the last passage right now, but I want to try just to pull together briefly some of the things that we said, and with that, and then we'll wrap up this discussion and pick up next week. The question that I asked beforehand, which again we have been asking over and over again, as do we really are we really hearing here in these departures from what seem like departures from classic Jewish approaches in Sefer Hasidim. Is this Christianity? To what can we attribute these attitudes and approaches that we don't hear elsewhere? I want here to suggest that, as we have seen in the other instances where we ask ourselves that question, yes, one explanation, one possibility is that these approaches, and here it's the embrace of this humiliation and shaming, that it is in fact the impact of the Christian environment. I want to suggest as an alternative that perhaps what we hear resonating here in Sefer Hasidim is, as we said beforehand, an alternative approach to Jewish sources. And I want to note, and I'm sorry that I don't have the source right here in front of us, perhaps I can bring it at the beginning of next week, is that there is something that approaches the attitude of Sefer Hasidim to already be found in an earlier midrash on that very same word, Hasid, Hasidah. Midrash Tehillim, in fact, in discussing why is the Hasidah called a Hasidah, suggests in the name of Huna Bar Papa that a stork is called a Hasidah because she allows herself to be trampled by her neighbors. And that, again, without, we don't have the text in front of us, so I don't want to belabor the point right now. But that idea that a Hasidah is called a Hasidah because she allows herself to be trampled by her neighbors, that suggestion by the Midrash, in fact, it does stand in contrast to the explanation of Rashi, the explanation of several other classic popular medieval commentators who suggest that the Hasidah is called a Hasidah because she feeds her young, because she displays certain midot characteristics that we associate with kindness. Again, going back to the first explanation that we saw in Sefer Hasidim itself for the etymology of the word Hasid. The explanation of Midrash Tehillim is much more akin with the second explanation that we saw in Sefer Hasidim, the idea, again, that a Hasidah allows herself to be trampled, and that's why she's called a Hasidah, really does, at least provide some kind of, it does resonate in some way and perhaps provide some possible Jewish source, Midrashic source, Talmudic tradition that perhaps was being teased out and obviously amplified and expanded upon by the authors of Sefer Hasidim, that need not be directly, or certainly need not be exclusively, attributed to Christian influence and impact, right? And so here, basically, what the argument, I think, on a larger scale, broader scale, is implying, and with this I'm going to conclude, is that Sefer Hasidim, in all of these unusual ways that it promotes different takes on piety, or different takes on what it means to be a genuinely religious person, is perhaps, again, amplifying, certainly, building upon, taking in new directions, but nonetheless doing so from a source, if only a marginal source, from a source within older, more ancient Jewish tradition itself. So with that, I'm going to pause. Chaim, I see you have a question. You're welcome to ask it. But let me just finish the sentence. With that, I'm going to pause. And hopefully next week, instead of looking at a brand new theme, what I'm going to try to do is pull together all of these different pieces and see if we could make, sort of broader sense of that argument and of this picture that we've been painting over the past several weeks. Yes, Chaim, please.
Or maybe Jesus also got it from a more ancient source.
Yeah, also possible, right? It is certainly right, and I just want to say that in a slightly different way. Taking that very seriously. Let's not forget that certainly early Christianity was another variation on many different voices, that certainly derived from, or that branched off from, a common Jewish tradition. By the period that we're talking about, by the 12th, 13th century, Christianity has obviously come onto its own and, taken off in all different kinds of directions as a distinct and different and separate religion. But certainly if we look back to some of its ancient roots, it's very clear that it was another variation on discussions that the rabbis were having and that the Essenes were having, and all the sects during the Second Temple period were having, that got then developed in different ways. Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions before we conclude for today? Okay, so thanks very much. Thanks for joining again, and we'll see each other again, I guess, I hope, next week.
Yes, thank you so much, Rachel. Looking forward to seeing you next week. And thank you everyone who joined us here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. You can learn about our other upcoming classes and register for any classes that might interest you on our website, drisha.org. Later out for now.
Bye-bye.